If you've only ever printed in PLA, you really owe it to yourself to try out ABS. Now, that being said, there's a lot of different things you have to take into consideration to be successful with ABS. First off, let's talk about it. I use Overture ABS, and in my experience, I've been very pleased with how this ABS goes down. First layers are absolutely gorgeous. They just come down like a treat. And actually, I feel like the first layers go down even better than most of the PLA that I work with. Now, chances are, if you've only ever printed in PLA, you've probably been turned off of ABS over the discussion about how difficult it is to work with. And the reality is, it's actually not that difficult to deal with. You just need to know a few things before you start. First off, that first layer we just talked about, it's very important, just like any other print you do. Now, in my case, I'm printing an Altum 1000 PEI, and for me, it goes down and sticks to my smooth PEI surface like a dream. I don't have to use any additives to make it work. I just got to make sure it's clean from any oils from my hands, and I use a type of alcohol to pre-clean it before I start. Next off, you're going to be printing with some higher temperatures that perhaps if you're using something like a Mark 8 hot end that has the PTFE Bowden tube going all the way down to the nozzle is probably not a good idea. In this case, we're printing at temperatures of 250 degrees on the hot end and 90 degrees on the bed. Now this is in Celsius, of course. Because of this, the temperature on a non-all-metal hot end could be enough to cause off-gassing from the PTFE Bowden tube, and that can be dangerous. Conversely, depending on what ABS you're using, there could be VOCs coming off of the ABS as it prints as well. That's that kind of gas that you smell, and it smells kind of industrial and plasticky. I've noticed with my Overture ABS that the smell is very faint, if really any. Now, ABS does have its difficulties. It started out, I believe, in the injection molding industry. Since then, for 3D printing applications, there are modified versions of ABS. Well, they are their own things, but they've been tweaked a little bit to make it easier in 3D printed applications, and we call this ASA. It is a little different. I've never had the pleasure of working with ASA, but you'll find that it is a little bit more expensive, but reports indicate that it is easier to work with. Those special conditions for getting ABS to work, let's talk about them. First off, ABS is temperature sensitive, meaning the temperature that it's printing from, which is 250 degrees at this particular moment coming out the nozzle, onto the bed, which is 90 degrees, has to deal with ambient temperature as well as a factor. That's why we print inside of an enclosure. It doesn't have to be an actively heated enclosure, although that being said, if you're printing something even remotely large, let's say something in excess of 100 millimeters, or about 100 millimeters, you're going to want to basically take your enclosure, close it up, and preheat it. Now, to do that, you just heat up your bed and you wait, maybe 10, 15 minutes at least. Get that ambient temperature inside of the enclosure as high as you can reasonably and comfortably do so. And the reason you want to do that is because plastic, or ABS in this case, will contract. So when things heat up, they expand, and when they cool down, they contract. Now with ABS, this particular issue is very apparent. So by having the ambient temperature as hot as possible, we reduce the amounts of contraction that happens per second. So it's still going to contract. It just won't contract as fast. And because of that, it will have better adhesion properties to the build surface. If it contracts too fast, you're just going to lift off of the build surface and you're going to get warping. And let's say you're printing something really large. Well, you still have to deal with that contraction issue, and maybe not on the build surface where you could have perfect adhesion, but around the prints themselves. This is where we start to see delamination occur. Now, delamination is two different layers, right? Let's say you got two layers and this is the edge. Well, if you contract too fast, somewhere in the middle of your print, where it's not as hot as it could be on the bed, but not as hot as a fresh layer of plastic going down from your nozzle. Well, that means somewhere in the middle of your print, things are cooling down. And as that happens, the contraction happens, and you start to split the layers at some point in your print. And that is delamination. When those two layers start to separate, things get worse and worse as it goes on. And that can happen at multiple different layers at different points for various different reasons, but mainly due to temperature. Now, if you have an actively heated enclosure, which is not all that common at the current time, because I believe the patent that was granted for heated enclosures is about to expire, if not already just expired relatively recently, within a year or so of this video. And once that patent expires, we're going to start seeing a flood of companies making actively heated enclosures to help combat issues like this in particular. Now, at the moment, we're just using a passively heated enclosure where we're just reflecting heat that gets generated back onto the surface and trapping it in as best we can. Now, there are definitely better enclosures out there than this Creality one that I got for my Ender 3. That being said, it is very much sufficient for my purposes. What I find is printing something very large, you get into that delamination issue and first layer issues, because you just have that much more force. The more plastic and surface area there is, the more chance there is for the force of all that plastic pulling up on each other as the layers go up and up is just increased the bigger your object that you're printing is. What I find ABS particularly good for are small parts that need to be functional. Like, for instance, this is a pop socket holder for my phone. I got a pop socket on the back of my phone. And for things like this, it's absolutely wonderful. This is about 50 millimeters across. Now, if you want to print a bunch of little things, ABS is wonderful. If you've got a full build surface to go with, and they're just tiny things, ABS has pretty good adhesion properties on the first layer, and seems to do quite well when retracting and priming, and its flow characteristics are very smooth. In fact, smoother than I would say PLA that I work with all the time, and definitely smoother than something like PETG. So, when it comes to ABS, yeah, it's a little bit of a learning curve, but the reality is it's a fantastic material to work with. You just have to, A, keep expectations relatively reasonable, and B, kind of choose the type of plastic you really need to use for what you're doing. So, I hope this little video was helpful. It's my take on ABS and the type and brand that I'm using. And I hope if you guys venture into this area, you find success like I have with it.